Prosecutor Thomas Watson humiliated a young black lawyer, unaware that this man would soon head the ethics committee with the power to expose Watson's biases. James Hunter, having endured injustice, finally had the chance to change the game. In a spacious courtroom, where every detail, from the cold gleam of the benches to the stately portrait on the wall, underscored the gravity of the proceedings, a tense atmosphere filled the air. Standing at a long oak table was James Hunter, a tall, lean man with a composed, confident look. Presenting his case for the first time, he argued with palpable enthusiasm, methodically building his client's defense. But each word, each gesture seemed to provoke only a smirk from Prosecutor Thomas Watson. Seated across from him, Watson observed the young lawyer with a cold, piercing stare that exuded arrogance and utter lack of respect. He had no qualms about throwing in snide remarks after every statement James made, as if to underscore that he did not belong there, let alone deserve to defend his position. With a raised eyebrow, Watson dryly commented on James's words, like he was evaluating a student who hadn't yet grown into a true professional. "An interesting approach, Mr. Hunter," Watson sneered sarcastically, with a mocking grin. "But perhaps you could at least try to stick to facts rather than fantasies?" The audience, including the judge, exchanged astonished glances, and a low murmur rippled through the room. Some people subtly shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with Watson's overt disrespect. He seemed to revel in the moment, confident in his immunity. James gritted his teeth, fighting to keep his composure. Taking a deep breath, he opened the next document and continued presenting his evidence. His voice was steady, his hands resting confidently on the table, though inside, a sense of bitterness and indignation was growing. He understood that Watson's remarks were not only an attack on his professionalism, but also an attempt to discredit him as a person, as a black man in a system where every step required double the effort. But Hunter could not afford to show weakness. However, each of James's attempts to keep his cool, and each clear argument he delivered, only seemed to fuel Watson's irritation. Looking directly at him, Watson raised his voice, nearly interrupting him mid-sentence, making his comments increasingly demeaning with each attempt. "Allow me to interrupt you, Mr. Hunter," he inserted coldly, "before you take this courtroom even further off course. Maybe you should go back to the basics of law." These words served as a final stroke in the humiliating picture the prosecutor was determined to paint in the eyes of the audience. When James returned home, the silence of the room immediately softened his tension, like a blanket draped over his shoulders. That evening, his wife and younger brother awaited him, always ready to support him, always by his side. His wife, Emma, met him with a warm gaze, sensing at once that something was wrong in his expression. She quietly approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder, while his brother Alex, who was sitting in the corner of the living room, straightened up, watching him attentively. Sitting on the couch, James took a deep breath and began recounting what had happened in court. He described each of the prosecutor's words, every dismissive gesture Watson had made, and how he'd repeatedly humiliated him in front of the public. As he spoke, Alex's face grew darker, his anger simmering. "That's simply unacceptable, James," Alex nearly shouted, springing from his chair. "You worked through sleepless nights, studied so hard, sacrificed so much for this career. And who does he think he is, to treat you like that?" James nodded silently, acknowledging his brother's point, but his gaze remained calm and somber. He was used to keeping his emotions in check, especially at times like this, when he felt bitterness and resentment. But internally, it weighed on him. He knew that all the effort he'd put into his education, internships, endless hours of work hadn't freed him from the bias that lingered in the air whenever he took his place at the courtroom table. Emma, unable to bear the silence any longer, sat next to him and took his hand. Her gentle, understanding gaze spoke more than words could. She knew how much this meant to James, and how painful it was to realize he still faced this kind of treatment, despite his achievements. Her presence enveloped him with a calming warmth, giving him a sense of safety. "James," she began softly, but with a firm note in her voice, "you have to show them that you won't be broken. You've earned your place, just as much as anyone else." The evening passed in quiet conversations and reflections. Brother Alex, despite his anger, did everything he could to support James, and Emma was by his side, encouraging him with every word. But even with their support, a heaviness remained within James. He could feel how deeply ingrained this system was, where skin color often spoke louder than accomplishments and abilities. The next day, as morning light began to paint the streets in soft, warm hues, James prepared for an ordinary day. But as he sifted through his mail, his gaze fell upon an envelope embossed with the official seal of the District Ethics Committee. His heart skipped a beat. With hands that trembled in a mixture of anticipation and disbelief, he carefully opened the envelope, the faint scent of fresh ink meeting his nose. Inside, on a piece of fine, heavy paper, lay a letter that would change the trajectory of his career. The words seemed almost surreal as he read them. James Hunter is hereby appointed as the new chairman of the District Ethics Committee. He blinked, reading the sentence over and over, his mind racing to grasp what this meant. For years, he had worked relentlessly, dedicating himself to his principles and enduring countless obstacles, always believing in the possibility of change, but never daring to expect this level of recognition so soon. And now, here it was. Proof that his commitment had been seen, his integrity acknowledged. A surge of pride filled him, a deep satisfaction mingling with joy that made his hands steady once more. Yet, as the realization settled, another emotion crept in, a profound sense of responsibility. The Ethics Committee wasn't just an administrative entity. It was a pillar of accountability, a force capable of guiding policies, influencing public opinion, and making decisions that could directly affect people's lives and livelihoods. He was now at the helm of that power. This position wasn't merely a symbol. It was a promise and a duty. James knew that every decision he made would hold consequences, and he was determined to ensure they were for the good. Setting the letter down with care, he leaned back, letting his thoughts wander to the weight of the role he was about to step into. He thought of the biases he himself had faced just the day before, and how, in this position, he had the authority to enact real, lasting change. As chairman, he could bring attention to systemic issues, spotlight injustices, and enforce strict adherence to the ethical standards he held dear. He envisioned a system that didn't just speak of fairness, but truly embodied it. A system that didn't simply promise equality, but actively pursued it. This role was more than a title. It was a chance to fight the very discrimination that had haunted him and others. And in this newfound power, he saw not only an opportunity for reform, but also a personal mission. He would work to dismantle the barriers and prejudices that plagued the system, one by one, until the path to justice was cleared. He would ensure that voices like his, once quieted, would be heard loudly and unequivocally. The day stretched before him with a new brightness, and as James prepared for this next chapter, he felt a renewed strength within. This was his moment to show everyone, his family, his colleagues, and perhaps even skeptics like Thomas Watson, that he not only belonged here, but was capable of reshaping the rules of the game. In a spacious conference room bathed in soft light, high-ranking officials of the district, including Prosecutor Thomas Watson, had gathered. They exchanged cautious glances, wondering what new leadership of the Ethics Committee would bring and what changes awaited them. The center of attention was James Hunter, who entered the room calmly but confidently and took his place at the podium. He looked composed, his calm smile revealing strength and determination. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is James Hunter, and starting today, I will be serving as chairman of the Ethics Committee, he began, nodding slightly to those present. James's gaze swept across the room, catching each face, finally stopping on Watson. Watson sat with a tense expression, hiding his shock behind a stone-like mask, but his eyes betrayed embarrassment and confusion. James continued, his voice becoming a bit louder and firmer. I intend to pay particular attention to procedures related to professional conduct and unacceptable biases, especially those concerning race and other discriminatory factors in judicial processes. We will review all guidelines and implement measures to eliminate any manifestations of injustice. Starting today, the committee will operate with greater transparency and fairness, and I am confident this will benefit the entire system." James's words hung in the air like a chime, and for a few moments, tense silence reigned in the room. Some officials exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by his resolve. Deep in the hall, Watson sat motionless, his face darkened, barely concealing his embarrassment and anger, unprepared for the fact that the very person he had publicly humiliated would now become his new superior and announce such sweeping changes. The meeting ended under the impression of James's new plans. As everyone began to leave the room, Watson collected his thoughts and approached James. His steps were slightly slower, his eyes holding a conflicted mix of guilt and resentment. Cautiously, he said, "Hunter, listen, maybe I was a bit harsh yesterday. I'd like to apologize if anything came across." James looked at him with a cold, impassive gaze and responded in an even tone. "I don't need your apologies, Watson. I expect to see real changes, not words." Watson's face darkened, and he visibly tensed, realizing that James was no longer someone who could be ignored or demeaned.